We have with us today William Marimow, the Philadelphia Inquirer, 1978 Pulitzer Prize winner. How would you define investigative or enterprise reporting, and perhaps in defining it, describe some of the key methods involved with it?
What I did was to kind of correlate my own thoughts with the thoughts of Bob Greene, who's an editor at Newsday, and he wrote an introduction for a textbook by Clark Mullenhoff called Investigative Reporting. And I'm going to quote from his introduction, and then I'll kind of amplify on his brief definition. And he says, and I quote, "Investigative reporting is subject to definition. It is the reporting through one's own work product and initiative, matters of importance, which some person or group want to keep secret." So essentially, Greene's definition and my own has three elements. First element is that investigative reporting, the original work by reporters. What that means essentially is that no one, whether it was a public official or a businessman or anyone else, held a news conference to announce the contents of this story. In other words, it was not something that the FBI turned up in their investigation and then released to the public. No report was issued by a public agency which led directly to this particular story. And there was no official investigation which preceded it and in fact provided the information that formed the nucleus of the story. So that's element number one, that what you have in the reporting is original. Number two, that the story be important. I believe that to be a significant piece of investigative reporting, the story should help the readers of your newspaper make informed decisions about the way their local, state, or federal government is working or failing to work, or the way their community is being run. And finally, the element that someone, for some reason, would very strongly prefer not to see this information come out. In effect, you're reporting something that is secret or very closely held information. And I've chosen a piece of reporting that I did in 1977, which I thought I would read the key 3 or 4 paragraphs. I sent this to Professor Harvey, and I don't think it's reached Buffalo yet, but when it does arrive, hopefully he'll distribute it to you, and you can evaluate for yourself whether this fits into the definition of investigative reporting that I've provided, or the one that eventually develops as you proceed with the course. At any rate, this is a story called The Homicide Files, and it was written in April 1977, and it's about how the Philadelphia Police Homicide Division went about solving murder cases. And I wrote this with Jonathan Newman, another reporter at the Inquirer, and this was one of the entries that we submitted for the Pulitzer Prize in 1978. At any rate, I'll read 3 or 4 paragraphs, and then I'll stop for questions. Medical problems are not rare among those interrogated by the Philadelphia Police Department's 84-member Homicide Division. In fact, a 4-month investigation by the Inquirer has found a pattern of beatings, threats of violence, intimidation, coercion, and knowing disregard for constitutional rights in the interrogation of homicide suspects and witnesses. The study shows that many homicide detectives, in beating or coercing suspects and later denying it under oath, have come to accept breaking the law as part of their job. As a result of those practices, the Inquirer has found there are cases in which murders have remained unsolved, killers have gone free, and innocent men have been imprisoned. From 1974 through this month, that is April 77, judges of the Common Pleas Court have been asked to rule in pretrial hearings on the legality of police investigations in 433 homicide cases. Those rulings require the judge to decide who is telling the truth, the police or the suspect. In most cases, the judge believes the police. In 80 of those cases, however, judges have ruled that the police acted illegally during homicide interrogations. The judges found in many cases that police had used either physical or psychological coercion. In some cases, the victim's injuries were documented by x-rays, medical records, and photographs. I'll stop there, and just so you see how I believe this story fits into the definition. 1, originality. This was work done exclusively by Jonathan and I. The police commissioner, the mayor, who was then Frank Rizzo, neither of them held a news conference to announce that this had happened. In fact, when the stories were published, they tried to deny that there was such a pattern. The story was important, in my opinion, because, in effect, we accused Philadelphia police officers of assaulting suspects and witnesses in criminal cases. Basically, we accused them of breaking the law in order to enforce the law. And finally, this was not a secret because it was there in the court testimony, but no one had ever put it together. No one had really acknowledged that any of this was true. And once the stories were written, it triggered the U.S. Justice Department and the FBI to begin a civil rights investigation of the Philadelphia police. I'll stop there for a moment to see if any of you have any questions.
What kind of documentation did you get with this? Were you forced to use some unnamed sources? And specifically, when is it appropriate to use unnamed sources?
The homicide files were based almost entirely on public records. And this was possible because in homicide cases, when a defendant has made a statement to the police, there are pretrial proceedings known as suppression hearings in which the defense lawyer will argue that these statements were obtained unlawfully for a myriad of reasons. The defense lawyer could claim that the police failed to give Miranda warnings to the defendant, or psychologically broke down the defendant's will by keeping him in custody for 24 hours straight, or that he assaulted the suspect in order to coerce him. Typically, the prosecution will attempt to argue the interrogation was entirely legal. And the net result of the suppression hearing is that there's a great deal of evidence, all put on the public record, all put into transcripts by court reporters, and a judge has to rule on these legal issues. Therefore, during the period that Jonathan and I surveyed, from 1974 through April 1977, we had access to records in 433 suppression hearings. And as I said, as I read to you from the part 1, 80 of those cases, a judge ruled that the police had acted illegally. There was documentary evidence in some of the more egregious cases, photographs which showed what the defendant looked like hours after he'd been interrogated by the police. There were x-rays and medical records and even eyewitness testimony by other people who'd been in custody, which enabled us to document in a pretty irrefutable way that these people had, during their time in police custody, experienced a deterioration in their physical condition. The only time that we needed to use unnamed sources, in part 1, as you'll see when you receive it, there were 3 interviews with the homicide detectives. We could only identify them as the young detective, the veteran detective, and the recently resigned detective. In those interviews, the detectives talk about the nature of their work, the nature of interrogations, and in one case, describe some of the beatings. We couldn't publish those detectives' names because, number one, there was a standing rule at the time by the police commissioner, his name was Joseph O'Neill, that he and he alone was the only person who could speak publicly from the police department. So speaking to us on the record for quotation would have resulted in some kind of disciplinary action. Secondly, as you'll see when you get the series, the nature of the interviews is such that policemen are admitting that their colleagues have committed crimes, have assaulted suspects and witnesses in homicide cases. If their names were published, they could become, in effect, witnesses in criminal cases. So there were very few unnamed sources in this very long series, but I think you understand the reason that we used them. As to when it's appropriate to use unnamed sources, Gene Foreman, who's the managing editor here at the Inquirer, and I had rather lengthy discussions earlier this month about drawing up some tentative guidelines for when to use unnamed sources. And we came up with these 6 guidelines, which I'll read to you. I'll be happy again to accept any questions. Guideline 1. The use of unnamed sources in a news story should be a last resort, not just an easy alternative to documenting the information from the public record or quoting someone willing to be named. In other words, work as hard as you can at finding something in official records or in court records, or identifying a person who would be willing to speak out rather than simply using an unnamed, unattributed source. 2, it should be clear to the reporter that the source's physical or be jeopardized if his or her name is revealed. I think that particular guideline is apropos of the interviews with the detectives, as I explained to you. Number 3, the information provided by the unnamed source must be very important. The story should be one that helps the newspaper's readers make informed decisions about their government or community. The information from the source should be crucial to the story, not tangential to the theme. For instance, if you're writing a story about a candidate for mayor and you have well-documented information about contributions that he's been receiving from convicted felons, and you can document that from the public record, that's excellent and it's appropriate. But if you have some point to make about the mayor's personality, perhaps that he's petty, I would say that would be something where if you can't document that from a record, or if you can't get someone to say that on the record for quotation, you might hesitate and pause before you use something like that, because it doesn't really matter that he's petty. And if it really does matter, can't you find some concrete documentable example to use? 4. To help readers evaluate the information, the unnamed source should be described as fully as possible without giving away the identity. Now, in the homicide files, if you'll recall, I said we used the young detective, the veteran detective, and the recently resigned detective. And I think those would be appropriate descriptions to help people get a sense of who the source is without focusing it so precisely that his supervisor or someone else could identify him. 5. If an unnamed source is quoted making derogatory statements about someone, such a statement must be one that enhances the public's understanding of a crucial issue. Here, reporters and editors must apply additional safeguards. The statement should be corroborated by public record or by named sources, or the source should have an impeccable record of reliability, as well as direct knowledge of the facts. 6. Reporters have to be free to use their judgment in granting confidentiality to sources while gathering facts. However, it should be understood that the agreement of confidence is between the source and the newspaper, and that the reporter will identify the source's identity to his or her editor. And those are the guidelines.
Have you ever found yourself in a position where you just plain weren't sure, and how did you settle the question with yourself inside?
Sure about the information?
Sure about whether you should keep a source unnamed, agree to go off the record?
I don't think that there's any one set of guidelines, but I think basically the prevailing feeling that I have is that if there's no other way that I can get that information, and the information's important, then I think I should define these terms a little bit better. To me, for attribution, for quotation, means that Professor Harvey makes these statements and you may quote him by name. Unattributed information means that you may use the information in the story and attribute it to a journalism professor or a professor at State University of New York, Buffalo. Off the record means that you can't use the information at all, but you simply have it for a background basis to help you understand the story you're writing. Now, I'm willing to conduct an interview on a not-for-attribution basis if I realize that party with whom I'm speaking will not speak to me in any other way, and I can't document it in any other way. So that's something that I would do frequently, but only when there's no other alternative.
How about off the record? When would you agree to do that, if ever?
Off the record entirely would be with someone who's not a direct participant in the story, but has some knowledge and might have some vulnerability if their name were ever associated with the information. For instance, if I'm doing a story about a grand jury investigation of a municipal union, I know an FBI agent in the labor squad which is investigating the case, but the agent in the labor squad is not assigned to the case. I may speak to the agent I know on an off-the-record basis in an effort to have him talk to the case agent, and he may then provide information to me which will give me leads to further my research.
Do you ever find yourself kind of negotiating with sources? They say they want off the record, negotiate to get them at least to go on an unattributed basis or whatever?
I'm sure that happens, but my strong preference increasingly has been to find a way to document this, find it in the court record somewhere, find it in the public records of a government agency, find someone who is willing to speak out publicly, work assiduously at that. When there's nothing whatsoever to back up a story that's on the record, I find myself hesitating and pausing increasingly.
Is there some circumstance, some story that has occurred that has made you increasingly pause and reflect on that point?
I think basically it's just that as I've done more and more sensitive stories, I've come to realize that if a reporter will simply dig in, not be impatient, be very deliberate and very thorough, there's usually some avenue in which a very sensitive story that doesn't appear to be documentable at first can be documented. And I think I gave Professor Harvey an example when we spoke on Tuesday about a story that I did in May of 1982. The president of the Fraternal Order of Police, which in Philadelphia is the bargaining representative for the 8,000-person police force, was the subject of a federal investigation looking into improper use of union funds. And this man, his name is Tom Garvey, said publicly that he was going to do absolutely everything he could to participate, to cooperate with the Justice Department investigation. Later I learned that Garvey had been subpoenaed by a federal grand jury and had, through his attorney, informed the grand jury that he would invoke his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination. In other words, he wouldn't testify. Now, just the fact that he wasn't going to testify may not have risen to the level of a news story in my mind, but the fact that he promised publicly to cooperate and then in secret was refusing did make it a story. I probably could have written that within 2 or 3 days of having heard that he had taken that action. But what I did was, after confirming the story from the investigative side, I pursued Garvey and other sources who were in the union, on the defense bar side, and ultimately wrote a story that not only said that he'd done this, but also explained why, tactically, defense lawyers might advise clients to take this posture. And I felt it was a much better rounded, much better documented story, even though it took me several weeks longer than it would have simply to report the fact that he had taken the Fifth Amendment.
When do you have enough information?
I would say that after you've exhausted all the possible routes of securing information, after you're 100% convinced that the story is true, and there's no element of the story that makes you hesitate and pause and worry about whether it's true or not.
What has been your most challenging investigation?
One of the most challenging was a series of stories I did about police promotion exams. I put this in context. Frank Rizzo was the mayor of Philadelphia from 1972 through January 1980, 2 4-year terms. And Rizzo, the man who became mayor, based largely on his reputation as a Philadelphia policeman from 1943 to 1970. He also became police commissioner and went from the commissionership right to the mayor's office. In Rizzo's last year as mayor, I received a phone call from a source within the police department who told me that the test for prospective lieutenants had some very, very suspicious results, and that a number of officers who had a history of doing poorly on these exams had suddenly become brilliant overnight. I think it would be comparable from someone taking college boards, well, let's say law boards, scoring 300s, and then suddenly rocketing up to 785, something like that. And in order to do this story, there were documents which showed the history of past failures on these tests, time and time again. And there was also police department records to show that these specific police sergeants had worked very closely with the very people who made up the exam. And I did that story based partially on records showing the discrepancy between past results and new results, and partly on police and fraternal order police sources detailing the relationships between the suspicious test scorers and the senior command who wrote the test. After that story appeared, the same type information came to me about the police sergeant's test and the test for prospective captains. I did the same thing there, basically taking past test results, which suggested the improbability of this overnight brilliance, and then being able to show that the very people who'd obtained these improbable scores were close friends or relatives or partners of people who'd actually drew up the test. That series ran for about 3 to 4 months, at least a story or two a week, and it resulted in the district attorney's office convening a grand jury to look into it, and the results of the test were scrutinized by test agency consultants. Some of the scores were disallowed, and the test procedure was revised so that it's no longer simply a multiple choice objective test.
What has been your most rewarding story in the sense, not in a sense of winning an award necessarily, but in a personal sense?
I think that, I don't think there's any one, but stories that I think have been a catalyst to change public policy or change the climate in Philadelphia. And I think the stories about police violence are ones that gave me a great deal of satisfaction, because prior to the publication of the homicide files, each week or each month, there were serious allegations about suspects and witnesses being beaten to smithereens in the homicide department. And our stories appeared in April 77. Jonathan Newman and I, the following summer, that summer 78, did a follow-up series called it The Homicide Files Revisited. And we were able to show that in 81 or 82 cases subsequent to our April 77 series, there had only been 2 allegations that people had been struck by police. So I really felt that once the spotlight had been shown on the homicide division, they cleaned up their act. 6 homicide detectives were indicted by a federal grand jury after those stories appeared, and the detectives were all convicted in federal court and went to jail as a result of that.
What are some of the emotions that you feel as an investigative reporter? Have you ever been frightened by what you've uncovered or by the possible consequences to your person? Perhaps there's some other strong emotions that you personally feel.
A lot of people have asked that, and I guess I feel that the people who've been retaliated against by and large have been the people who have spoken, in particular in the police cases, who spoke on the record and described the conduct of the police. But I've always felt that we were out there to inform the public. I think that the subjects of our stories are probably cognizant of that too. In a way, we're a conduit for that information. We're an assembler, an assimilator, and an analyst of that information. And so far, I've never felt really personally threatened.
What other feelings might you have? Do you ever get depressed at the state of the world when you get into some of these stories?
Sometimes I think I've heard a quotation that as far as the human being is concerned, the odds are 9 to 5 against. I don't think I really believe that, but sometimes I'm struck by the accuracy of that statement. I guess the Abscam undercover investigation that the FBI conducted in 1980, which I'll describe to you in brief. The FBI basically created a fictitious corporation known as Abdul Enterprises Incorporated and staffed it with a phony Arab sheik who was allegedly coming to the United States to make investments and was hoping that public officials would sponsor private immigration bills so that he could reside here permanently. And the net result of that was that the FBI was able to record on videotape, I think, 9 or 10 public officials accepting cash from the FBI's phony sheik, basically payoffs for various activities such as sponsoring immigration bills or helping a project. At any rate, I covered Abscam for the Inquirer, and several of the people who were indicted and convicted in the Abscam investigation were Philadelphia politicians. There were 3 city councilmen, Harry Gennady, George Schwartz, and Lou Johansson, and 2 Philadelphia congressmen, Ray Lederer and Michael Ozzie Myers. And seeing them and seeing the blatant greed there on camera was very, very disheartening, and it could make one cynical.